In this video, I'm going to show you how I made this infinitely large terrain. It's entirely procedural, so it's just a plane that uses procedural textures to create the rivers and fields and mountains and trees and stuff. Like I said, it can be as big as you want. All you have to do is tile it bigger, and as you tile it, the procedural texture will take care of creating the additional objects. There's no tiling, there's no repeating or anything like that. And the only thing it uses is a plane, a procedural texture, and a displacement node. Let's take a look at the project. All right, so here's a still from the animation. So you can see we've got mountains, water features, kind of randomized fields, some roads going through. We even have like villages or towns, individual houses that show up different places, and of course randomized field textures. The idea is obviously a high altitude kind of thing. If you zoomed in on this, it would lose a lot of its realism. But if you're doing aviation animations at high altitude, or even maybe a still image at a fairly high altitude, I think it does a pretty good job. All right, here's the project file. I've got just a couple of assets in here. There's not really a lot going on. There's a plane that is the background horizon. This is the sky and the sun and the clouds in the background. So just take a look at that. And the shader for that is fairly simple. Got everything in here is procedural, so I didn't want to use any image textures at all. So just starting off with a gradient. There you go, and then running that through a color ramp, and then creating kind of a cloud texture, crushing it with a color ramp, combining the two, running it through an emission shader, and you got a sky background that you can customize as much as you want. You could, if you want, put your own texture back here. If you had an image texture like mountains or something in the back, you could put that in. But I really wanted to see if I could do this just procedurally. So that's the sky. Let's take a look at the ground. I'm going to go to the top view here. And the shader looks like this. So one shader for the whole thing, and the basic principle is these blue nodes, these groups here, are all masks. They create black and white images that tell Blender to put some things in some places and not to put things in other places. So I have masks for fields, I have masks for roads, water, mountains, trees, houses, a village. These green nodes here, these are the actual textures. So it's going to be like mossy ground or fields of lettuce or something like that. And then these orange nodes here combine from the displacement output of these nodes to create a displacement map for these, or think of it as a bump map. It's a displacement map. And then all of those, all this down here creates the displacement map for it. And I reuse many of the masks to create the displacement. So things like the mountain mask is going to create create bumps that go up. The water mask is going to create slightly recessed areas, the same with the roads. The small fields is going to create the texture of the fields, and the house and village mask is going to create buildings that pop up out of the ground. And then the tree mask is going to define where the trees actually get poked out of the ground. So let's take a look at some of these. I think once you get one of them, you'll probably be able to figure out the rest. Let's start with the road texture. Let's start with roads. And so if I render this now, so I'm just looking at the road texture. You can see that the road mask has three outputs. There's a mask, there's a random rotation number, and then there's a road border. And right now we're just looking at the mask. So anything that's black is going to be a road. Anything that's white is going to be something other than a road. And looking inside of this road mask here, you can see that it starts off with a Voronoi texture that uses the distance to edge. And if we look at just that Voronoi, you can see how that looks. It's very cellular looking, and I'm going to take off that randomness. So this is the default Voronoi. Sharp edges, kind of grayscale here, distance to edge. And from that, if you take a noise texture and you take the factor out of that and you put that into the randomness, you can get the edges of the Voronoi to curve. And the amount of curve that goes in here is based on how aggressive you are with these values in here. So the more you change these, the more squiggles you're going to get. For this, I was just kind of trying to shoot for country roads, kind of windy country roads, so I wasn't very aggressive with those. If you then take, well, then what I do is I mix it in with this mask. This is a mountain mask, so this is going to tell, we'll look at this later, but this is saying where I want mountains, where I don't want mountains. I don't want the roads to go through the mountains, so I use this mask to take the mountains out of the road. So if you look at, say, this, you can see that by running the Voronoi through a color ramp set to constant, you get really sharp lines here. And the nice thing about the procedurals is it doesn't matter how far I zoom in here, you're always going to get crisp lines. Like there's no pixelation or anything, right? Because it's a vector. And then you can see here we've got these blank areas here. That's because this mountain mask is being overlaid on top of the roads, because I didn't want the roads necessarily to go over the mountains. So we'll see that over and over again, where I take one mask, in this case the roads, and then I'll have it interact with another mask to kind of fine-tune exactly where we want. So we've got the roads kind of going all over the place, and then we use the mountain mask to take out roads from where we don't want them to be. Put this back to where it was. All right, the next value here, the next output here is this. Oh, you know what? I'm going to skip down. I'm going to do 2 down. This is a border, is a road border. This was used for creating hedges and trees along the sides of the roads, and that's just this here. And all this is doing is it's taking the original road, making it thicker, and then overlaying a black line in the middle of it, inverting it. So I'm just basically, painting a black line down the middle of a thicker road, and that's how I get these white edges here. And these are going to be, like I said, trees and stuff that line the edges of the roads. The middle value here that comes out, this random number. So if you look here, I've got 2 Voronoi textures. One is the distance to edge, and one is the F1 Euclidean. And you notice that I've got the same values being put into it. So the scale value is put into both of them, and the same noise value is put into the randomness. And the reason I do that is that means that this pattern is going to be the same for both of these Voronoi, even though the output is going to be different. This is going to be like a grayscale output, and this one I'm using the color output to create this mosaic of random colors. So if I go back to the roads, say take a look at this, keep an eye here on this one, and if I go to the border, you can see how the patterns are all the same. That I've got the same outlines. Now, the nice thing about these colors is the colors are actually numbers. Now, if you think of them, they're random numbers, and we can use those random numbers to create randomness further down the line. And that's what we do with the individual fields. So let's take a look at how I use this random number to generate randomness in another part of the map. So now we're going to look at the small fields. And this is going to create the little individual fields that go into the picture. So I'm talking about creating these little fields here. So the roads are these things here. Go around like this. And you can see how the mountain cuts it out, because we use the mountain mask to cut the road out. And then within this border of roads, I want a bunch of fields. And I want those fields to be oriented in some direction, but then I want the fields within another road to be oriented in a different direction, right? Because that creates some of that kind of patchwork look, is that you don't want all the fields pointing in the same direction. Like these point this way, these point that way. So you get the point. So we can use this random number output as a value within this group for the small field. So I look inside here. You can see over here on the left, I'm using the road mask again, and I'm using that random rotation number, which is what this is, feeding that into a mapping node. By the way, all of the mapping uses generated textures, right? There are no UVs or anything on this either. It's all generated global textures. So that random number gets fed into the rotation, which is going to randomly rotate these cells, and then that number is then rotated, or that number is then fed into another mapping. Let me show you what this looks like. So a little harder to see here because I've got so much color going on, but now we're actually looking inside this small fields. And if you can see here, this is the border of a road here, right? So this random number coming in here is causing these fields to get rotated this way, but it's causing these to get rotated this way, and these to get rotated, even more of an angle. So you can see how they're kind of rotated within their borders individually. That's what this does. And then that gets fed into another mapping node where I then stretch the y-axis, because I wanted these to be elongated fields. If by default the Voronoi would be kind of squarish, I wanted them to be more rectangular. So rotate them first individually within these cells, and then once they're in the cells, stretch them out. All right. And then I go similar kind of trick where I've got same values going into a Voronoi texture using Euclidean and another one distance to edge. So this is the color one, and this is the grayscale cells that we saw before. And what we're looking at now is the output of this Voronoi. We can see that we've got created this patchwork of all these different colors based, randomly oriented within each of the roads. All right, that's the first output. That output, that color output, gets fed all the way down here, and it gets fed into 4 compare nodes. And the compare node is going to output a 0 or 1 value based on what's coming in here. So if the value, one of these colors coming in here, is between 0 and 0.2, right? So if it's what you're doing, you're looking at a 0.1 value, and then the epsilon is 0.1. So anything 0.1 below or 0.1 above, so 0 to 0.2, if this value coming in is between 0 and 0.2, it's going to output a 1, and 1 is white. And if it's not, it's going to output 0, which is black. So we can take a look at this compare node output, which is field group 1 here, and see what happens. This effectively groups colors that are similar together across the board, and then the same thing happens all the way down here. So this lets me assign different colors to different parts of the map. So this is going to get maybe browns, this one's going to get greens, maybe dark greens, maybe yellows or something like that. And that's what all these do. They get split out and they get grouped into these groups here. And then the last output from here is this Hedgerow Mask. And I want it to have hedges along the edges of the roads and around the edges of the fields. And all this is it takes the information from the field borders, and then, like we saw with the road mass, it's going to remove the roads. So actually, it's going to add the roads in. So that's what these lines are here. So it's taking the field borders, adding the roads in, but it's also then subtracting out. There's a water mask for lakes and rivers, right? I don't want trees in my lakes and rivers, so I subtract the water there. And I also want, I don't want the hedges to grow through buildings, so I subtract the buildings out. And I don't want these hedge borders on the mountains, so I use the mountain mask to remove those from the mask. And I don't want these field borders to be inside of the forested areas either, so I use my tree mask and I subtract the trees out. And the resulting mask looks like this. So you can see that all this area would be probably mountain area, and then with some water features and stuff. So anything that's black is going to be not the hedgerow, and anything that's white is going to be the hedges and trees that grow along the edge of the hedges. All right, so let's take a look at. All right, so like I said, all the blue ones are masks. The green ones are textures. So if we look at maybe this lettuce texture here, zoom in. I think I have displacement still turned on. Let's turn that off. So you can see this is just a kind of like something was planted in rows. And then associated with each of these colors is a displacement map, which is just a grayscale. Gray is going to be higher, and then black is going to be 0 elevation. So the same thing here, we've got colors, and then we have a grayed out version of it that's going to be used to create displacement. And that's what these mixed nodes do. So inside these are simply procedural noise. Right, so we got the Voronoi texture going through some color ramps that create, basic colors here. I mean, I'm sure you've seen stuff like this before. You create noise using color ramps, and they use the same or similar noise to create this displacement thing, which is then combined using these masks. So what we're looking at here, as you can see, these two colors, this is one of these is this field and the other is this field, are being combined through this mix shader using field group 4. And then we go and we add in another texture, this wheat texture, which is going to be yellow. We add that to the mix, and then we add the next one to the mix. And you can see how we're just building up our random fields here using these field groups to do that. And then we finally get to the end here. We've got all of our fields put together using these various masks. So this is just the color of the farmland at this point. All right, so we've got our furrows, different planting, and you can see that things are kind of in different, they're oriented a little differently. They got some going vertically, some going this way, some going that way. So it adds to that randomness. And that is what all of this here does. These 4 orange together, the output from them is basically the composite of all of these, but in grayscale. And then this output is then used eventually to create the displacement map so we can get bumps for the various trees and various farmland elements. So anyway, that's why most of these things work. One interesting kind of little different one are the villages and the houses. So I wanted the houses to have red roofs and white walls. So we can see here, you can see this is probably like a at altitude type picture you might see. So I didn't want the buildings to be just white. I wanted them to have something going on here between the roofs and the walls. If you look closely at them, which is not something you would do unless you were doing like a Minecraft kind of thing, because it doesn't look particularly real, but at a distance I think it's okay. But the thing here is that the roofs have one color and it's kind of randomized, and the walls have a different color, which gives the illusion that we got some kind of randomized roofing going on there, not just white blobs. And the way I figured out how to do that, which I thought was kind of interesting, is we'll just look at the villages here. So there's 2 masks here. There's one that's the boundary mask, and this is just a hard black and white mask that says where I want villages to be. All this stuff is also customizable too. So adjusting any of these masks in here would move the villages around, make them bigger, smaller, more prolific, less prolific. So all these values can be adjusted to kind of change the overall look of the scene. So this boundary building mask creates these white blobs where the villages will exist, and then this building mask is the actual buildings themselves. So here I'm using another Voronoi texture, but this time using the Manhattan function, and then just using a constant color ramp. And then if you adjust this black and white value here, you're going to get either bigger or smaller streets. But in order to get the different colors on the roofs, I had to do something differently, because you got to remember, this is only on a plane. There is no geometry yet, because the geometry doesn't exist until it goes through this displacement node, right? Up until then, it's just a flat plane, so there are no walls to assign colors to, right? We're just looking at a 2-dimensional plane. So if we look in here at the color, so now we're looking at this village texture shader. All right, I'm going to output this, and you can see, let that run. Maybe zoom in. That's good. So you can see what we've got. We've got kind of mixes of oranges and reds and browns, and this dark gray stuff is supposed to be the streets, and these are the roofs. But I was curious, how do you get the walls of the building to have a different color? And what I came up with was using the building mask, that black and white, so remember these were white, using that building mask as an input into a bump map. And if we look at what that looks like, you can see that Blender's assuming that anything that's white is sticking out and that anything that's black is not sticking out. And it creates this map where anything that's blue is on the z-axis pointing straight up, and anything that's not blue is going to be, once we run it through the displacement node, it's going to be a wall of the building. And if we separate the z value out and See what that looks like. You see it turns it into a kind of a grayscale map where we've got just the outlines of the buildings. And then this next multiply node, I wasn't getting enough of a signal into this color ramp, so this is just kind of like a booster, little signal booster. It's going to make it a little bit harsher, a little more distinct. So I've got these lines at the edges of the buildings, and then finally I run that through a color ramp. And this is what we get. We get red where we want the roofs, and we got this nice white outline of where the walls will be eventually, once they get extruded out. I didn't want the walls to be, I didn't want the roofs to be all the same color. I wanted some variety there. So we use the trick of using the hue and saturation for randomness. Now, starting off with a Voronoi texture using Euclidean, we're going to get this square mosaic of colors. And then using that value, and if I run that through a multiply node, I can actually like crunch the hue range down to be something smaller. So now you can see that I went from that rainbow of colors down to just blues. And since I want reds and oranges and yellows, which are a higher number than blues, I can add 0.49 to it, and that pushes that whole hue into the range number. And then that is then used to feed the actual red, green, or red-brown colors of the roofs. And then the final mask, oops, not what I wanted to do. Final mask looks like this, where we've got the roof textures, and then these white pieces will be eventually extruded up and be the white walls, and then this asphalt is just this brown stuff in the street. So, once again, what we're looking at is something like this, where we've got red roof with white walls that are extruded up once the displacement happens. All right, so that's the houses. So let's pop out of there. And the last thing here, that's pretty much the way the masks work. Black and white, where to put something, where not to put something. The last node here is this horizon haze node. And this is a cheap way to create the faded horizon that we got here. You have to see it kind of goes blue as it gets further horizon. You could do this with volumetrics, but volumetrics are expensive. And since we use Blender, we are not into spending stuff, so it's cheap, right? So cheap is good. I got this horizon haze. Take a look inside there. And this only works if you're looking through the viewport. So I'm going to take a look at, there we go, the color. And you can see that what happens here is it uses the light path node with the ray length. And that's just going to calculate the distance from your camera out. So like I said, this does not work when you're outside the camera view. When you're outside the camera view, you're not going to see much. It's going to be just white or gray. You're only going to see it when the light path makes sense. I divide that by 100,000. Normally, in like a normal size scene, I would not divide that by such a big number, maybe 950, maybe 1,000. So if your scene and you're trying to use this as maybe a different size than mine and you're not getting a gradient here, you might want to change that value. The color ramp adjusts both how far this gradient comes out and how sharp it is. So you can make it come further into the scene if you want, and you can make it crisper or more subtle if you want that way. And then the final result is this, where you get this blue edging here, and then once the background sky is put behind it, it fades nicely into the sky. And like I said, it is not expensive to run at all. It might be a little too much. Pull that back a bit. Make it more subtle. There. All right. All right. So that is the horizon. And then the only thing left here is the displacement setup. So starting off with this noise texture, just creating some dark spots and light spots. So dark is going to be a dip, and then the light spot is going to be a hill. And then combining that with our mountain height map. So the height map on the mountains looks like this. And I didn't go into the detail of the mountain mask, but it's just a noise texture. Right, with the color ramp on it, using a noise texture. And then you can adjust how high the mountains are with this value here. If you make this a bigger number, the mountains will be taller. small number, they'll be smaller. All right. So it takes the mountain mask combined with this kind of just rolling hill thing, and we get this. And we can see that we got the mountains on top of the rolling hills. And then we got the crop details, which looks like this. But this is too strong. This is going to create just massive valleys and gullies in it. So within the shader, I often use a map range node to kind of blend things out, soften them up. So here I'm only taking half the distance here. I'm going from 0 to 1 range and then pushing it down to a 0.5 to 1 range. It's still there. You can still see it maybe subtly. I don't know if YouTube's going to capture it, but it's still there subtle. And then we mix that together and we create, a combined mask. At this point, the changes are going to be quite subtle because the displacement node is very sensitive to blacks and whites and stuff. So we really are dealing with just very small changes of shades and gray. And that's basically what happens all the way along here. We add in the displacement node for the water. So we use the water mask to create slightly recessed areas. The roads also get slightly decreased areas. And then the hedges get a slightly bumped up area. And the houses and villages, of course, go up. And the tree, of course, goes up. So the final mask looks like this. And if we look really closely here, you can see that we've got, subtle roads and rivers here. Like this is probably a lake or something. This is probably a river. And this would be a road here. Then kind of blends into a mountain and things fade off. So the final effect of the displacement node is quite subtle. And that is about it. I've uploaded this project to BlendSwap. If you're interested in downloading it, please do so. And if you find a better way to do something, please let us know. And if you do something cool with it, certainly let us know. All right. I hope that was helpful. Thank you for watching.